Good evening. I'd like to welcome you to this very special session tonight. I'm David Black. I'm the president and CEO of the SETI Institute. And what you're going to hear tonight, I think, is going to be extremely special. I had an opportunity to sit in on part of the discussions that took place over the last 2 days by the group that you're going to hear from, and I was literally blown away. I mean, some of the things they were talking about, the sharing of ideas that took place amongst the group, it was really, truly incredible, and I think you'll get a sense of that tonight as you listen to the summary and then have an opportunity to ask everybody who participated in the workshop any questions that come to your mind. The topic, as you know, is non-human communication. It was a workshop for 2 days. And what's interesting is, while people may not think of the SETI Institute as being involved that much, the key word here is communication and perhaps non-human. And one of the things that the Institute is looking at as we go forward into the future are ways to understand how we could communicate if we do have the opportunity to get in touch with civilizations other than our own somewhere, how they might want to communicate with us, and to better understand what path in the evolution that brought us to where we are might be a common factor no matter where life would be found. So I think these people have started to address some of those challenges. They're a very interesting group of people. I was delighted to share some time with them. So I won't stand up here any longer. Let me introduce Denise, who's sort of brought this whole group together, and you'll start us off. Denise?
Thank you, David. Welcome, everyone. Very focused goals. One was really to explore what we know about non-human communication and look at some of the new tools that have really become available in the last decade or even the last few years in some cases, and focus our discussion on how we might utilize some of these tools to answer some questions we've had for many, many decades. And the reality is there are many of us scientists who have our own custom data sets from different types of animals, and we all struggle to do things like categorize sounds and figure out how to analyze data. So the idea is not new. We're just trying to keep the momentum going and to make progress in the field. So like I said, we all have data sets sitting in our offices somewhere we're trying to work through, and there's all this great new technology and techniques available. So what we really are hoping to do is mine our data sets and try to speed up some answers to the questions of whether animals have any kind of complex communication, language, cognition, or intelligence. Just to introduce everybody who was at the workshop, and they'll all be up here after this initial introduction by a few of us, so you'll get a chance to answer questions. Michael Cohen is an assistant professor in the University of Wisconsin, who's done some fascinating work with gibbons and their vocalizations. Lawrence Doyle is a scientist here, of course, at the SETI Institute. John Elliott, who Skyped in with us from England, is a reader at Leeds University in the UK and works with artificial intelligence and linguistics. Jerry Harp is a director of the SETI Institute and also a research scientist here. Denise Herzing, that's me. I'm the research director of the Wild Dolphin Project and also am in Department of Biological Sciences at Florida Atlantic. Lori Marino is a neuroscientist, specializes in animal behavior, brains, and intelligence. Brenda McCowan is a professor of ethology at Davis, University of California, Davis, who works with a variety of different types of animals and statistical techniques for looking at them. Kon Slobodchikov is a professor emeritus, and he's done some stunning work with prairie dogs, looking at the complicated alarm calls they make and the potential for a language in that species. Doug Varcock is the director of interstellar message composition here at SETI Institute. I never pronounce your name right, Doug. And Lori Walton is a member of the permanent group on SETI, and special thanks to Lori for helping me coordinate and do a lot of the logistics here. So she's very involved in SETI. Woo-hoo. So the workshop was divided like this. We spent basically day one, and we basically presented talks to each other on our work and issues we thought were important. The first area was complex animal communication, included myself, Con, and Michael. In the afternoon, we looked at information theory and heard from Lawrence Doyle and Brenda McCowan on their work. And this morning, Lori Marino talked to us about intelligence and the evolution of intelligence and brains. John Elliott talked to us about AI work that he's done with robots. And Jerry Harp and Doug also talked about the link with SETI and some of the ideas they had around what we were talking about. So in the complex animal communication area of our discussion, one of the big things we all sort of agreed on is there's a huge need to try to categorize animal signals, not only vocalizations, but other modalities of communication, body postures, taste, smell, whatever. And the idea that there are these fascinating new computer techniques to allow us to mine our databases and have data-driven categories of vocalizations, for example, instead of categories that we think are important to the animals. After we get to this point, we're hoping to match types of sounds and correlate this with ethological observations and information to get at what we're really interested in, which is what is the meaning and the function of animal communication. What are they talking about and saying to each other? Now, in many of our fields, mine specifically with dolphins, we're aware there are many potential artifacts with our data, and we discuss those. And then we discussed other potential tools and techniques that include things like cognitive interfaces as a way to explore animal communication. So for example, trying to categorize sounds are very difficult, at least in the dolphin world. You know, we don't know whether sounds are very discrete units and referential, or whether they're graded systems that just communicate emotion and motivational states. We use everything from qualitative techniques, just looking at a spectrogram and comparing it to how another spectrogram looks like by human judges. But we do use computer techniques, neural nets, where we train computer programs. What you see there are examples of signature whistles, for example, that have been trained into a computer, the green and the red whistles on the upper right, to see if we can quantify how different whistles are in this case, to give us a sense numerically. We also explore looking at the smallest units of information through computer techniques, but most important, new techniques, data-driven systems that allow us to categorize signals without, at least we think, human bias, that will give us perhaps real categories that the animals are using, not what we think they should be using. Another main focus of conversation was the idea that animals don't communicate with a single sense. They don't just use sound. They use sound, but they use body posture, and they use touch, and they use these things simultaneously, sequentially, in a complicated way. It's often the case we focus on one modality and think that's how we're going to figure out animal communication. So we were all in agreement that we needed to look at multi-modalities for communication, look at the complexity within sequences, and link it to meaning and function by correlating it with behavioral context. That being said, the next layer of analysis is to look at how social structures might determine animal communication, relationships, and higher level aspects. And these are all possible with new computer techniques. Some of the artifacts in our data sets are it's very important to realize they're there. In my own field of dolphins, I'll give you an example. On the upper left, there's a shot of a dolphin who's making a bubble ring, which is kind of like a smoke ring. Now in the wild, this signal is used only when they're about to fight each other. It's a signal of annoyance and aggression. But if you look on YouTube, you can find videos from captivity where you see dolphins creating bubble rings, biting them like toys, and playing with them. So it's important to understand potential artifacts of looking at animals in constrained or captive situations versus how they might use it in their own systems. Secondly, we have to remind ourselves to record information above and beyond the human senses, since many animals, dolphins make sounds into the ultrasonic, bats do, bees use ultraviolet light. We know all this, but it's important to remember when we're looking at data sets. We talked about our anthropomorphic ways of biasing our own data. How do we get around being human and trying to be objective? Actually, I'm not human, I'm a dolphin, so I have an advantage. And another big area was the idea of putting animal communication, non-human animal communication, in a larger evolutionary context That includes continuity. We know there's physical continuity in species, and the idea of being open to looking at cognitive continuity with other species. That might include the potential for things like language. And then finally, we talked about looking at our data with different temporal scales. The idea that if you're analyzing a humpback whale song and you speed it up, it might sound like a bird song. And if you look at dolphin vocalizations, you might slow them down and they might sound like whale songs. So the idea of looking at systems comparatively, but adjusting their temporal scales, that might give us some insight into their communication. And then finally, we had a look at other potential ways to get at how complex animal communication might be. And that would be to look at, first of all, how do other species communicate with each other? You know, there might be some knowledge in the natural world, how other animals, and they do, use each other's calls, tap into information in the environment based on an alarm call of another species. So there might be some information to be had by looking at how other animals interact in a detailed way. And then finally, certainly there have been cognitive interfaces like keyboards, both with bonobo chimps, dolphins, and then techniques like Irene Pepperberg used with her parrots to explore animal minds and complex communication. That also might give us some insight into potential differences in our species. And now Lawrence is going to kind of summarize information theory section to give you a sense of what we did.
Thank you, Denise, for setting up this workshop. Basically, for the last 100 or so years, by the way, my background's astrophysics, so any mistakes I make in biology are not going to be held against me in my career. So I'll say wild and crazy things, and except when it comes to astrophysics. Basically, my interest goes way back with Brendan McCowan and our graduate student, Sean Hanser. And the basic idea was that, you know, people have fought for the past maybe 100 years that humans biologically are entirely different. All the other animals did their own thing, but humans are completely different. And of course, that's now proved to be a myth. There's this nice continuity. We decided to go for tool making, and we went crazy with it, but that's only a really recent event. Well, now we're basically looking at communication systems, and what we generally run into is that the human communication system is entirely different than all other communication systems on Earth. And we're looking into kind of, shall we say, dissolving that notion as best we can. And for SETI, that's an important feature, because SETI basically says what happened here could happen somewhere else. So if there's a continuity of communication, then the continuity that exists here would exist elsewhere, all of the conditions being the same. So basically what we worked on is sequences, and these are dolphins, bottlenose dolphin sonograms. And we look at individual sequences. In information theory, you look at how many signals you have. That's called a zero-order entropy. By the way, information theory was developed for computers. And initially for telephone lines, it was developed at Bell Labs to see how much information were going along telephone lines, so they knew how many telephone lines to build, basically. But we had this idea that we would apply it to bottlenose dolphins to see how much information in bits they were transmitting to each other, and what kind of insights we could get into the critters by looking at the information content changes within their communication system. So you can look at sequences, and basically, in some sense, you can, to use an analogy from English, you can look at single signals, how many signal types. In English, it would be 27 types, because you also include space. And you take the log base 2, which puts that many signal types into bits. And now you have a system for measuring the amount of information in bits that's being transmitted. But you say, okay, what if we have just the signal types? That's called a zero-order entropy. The zero-order entropy of English is 4.75 bits, which is basically the log base 2 of 27. So you say to yourself, okay, well, now what if there's structure? Well, you look at the occurrence of two signals together, and the equivalent in English would be the digram structure. And you see how many diagrams there are in Dolphinese. I can use the term Dolphinese because I'm an astronomer. Don't cringe, Brenda. So basically, what happens is when you information entropy, if left completely to itself, has the highest entropy. Entropy means choices in our context. It means states in terms of thermodynamic entropy, but we're using information entropy. So entropy is the measure of constraints, basically. And if before you measure the entropy of say, a vocal system like dolphins, it could be considered uncertainty. After you measure it, it can be considered information. So, for example, if you say, I'm thinking of a word, and you say, it ends in E, and I say yes, well, you still have a gazillion words. You still don't know what the word is. But if you take a higher uncertainty risk at the beginning, and I say, I'm thinking of a word, and you say the first letter's Q, and I go, yes, you've almost got the word. So you got more information with a higher uncertainty once you make the measurement. Okay, so we're applying this to dolphins, and we're saying, okay, what is the diagram structure of dolphins? Well, what would happen is, if they didn't have any diagram structure, then there wouldn't have been any decrease in the entropy. The entropy decreases because we're putting constraining rules on it. Huh? Oh yeah, sorry. It means two letters in a row. Like I'm thinking of a letter. You wouldn't guess H. But if I say I'm thinking of a letter, and the constraint, I'm putting on it, is the first letter's a T and it's the second letter. Well, now you're going to guess an H. So you can see there's conditional probability of occurrence in the English language. And what you can do is put those rules on little at a time, and what you'll do is have a computer start to derive English. As you put the grammatical and spelling rules, you start to get real English words. We have the opposite problem. We've got this huge data set of dolphin vocalizations, and we have to back out the relationships. What we can do is not measure what the dolphins are saying, but what they could say with their communication system. Because what information theory measures is the carrying capacity. So if we could find common symbols, we could answer the question, will Shakespeare ever be translated into dolphin? In other words, does dolphin have the carrying capacity to translate? So basically, we have the zero-order entropy, how many signals. Then we looked at something called the Ziff slope. And basically, Ziff was a linguist. Some of you have heard this before. But he basically plotted the frequency of, these are log scales, don't worry about it. He plotted the frequency of occurrence against in order of rank. In other words, first, second, third, fourth, fifth. So picture this is the frequency of occurrence. That would be an E in English letters. That would be, next one would be a T, and then an A on down to Q. And this line can be drawn through that relationship, and it gives a 45-degree slope. Well, you say, okay, well, so what? Well, let's do it with Chinese characters, -1. Oh, that's interesting. Let's do it with Nootka, -1. Let's do it with a whole bunch of languages, -1, -1, -1, -1. So basically, the frequency of occurrence distribution gives this -1 45-degree slope in English languages. So naturally, we did it with dolphins, -1. That's really fun. So what if you do it with babies babbling? Well, flatter, not -1, -0.8 or 0.75 or whatever we got. Okay, so that's babies babbling, but you can watch them go past the -1, and what that means is when they get a real high slope, they're saying mama, 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 they're repeating stuff. So the most frequent point is way larger than the next. So, and then they settle in at about, I don't know, age 5 or something, they start to get a -1 slope. So, fortunately, at Brenda's facility, when she's directing the cetacean center, 2 baby dolphins were born. and they fit right on baby babbling. So the baby dolphins were babbling their whistles. Correct me if I'm wrong. So, and we could watch them go up. They didn't overshoot very much, so they don't drive their moms crazy going, mama, mama, mama. But they did land about -1 at about, what was it, 20 months? Something like that? So yeah, so the basic idea is that, you know, they're changing. Here's a diagnostic for a change in the relationship between signals. So Zipf's law is an indicator, not a result. It indicates there may be complexity in the system. And when we say complexity, what we mean is there's a relationship between signals. So naturally, one wants to apply this to humpback whales, and we did. We applied information theory to humpback whales. And elephants, are you doing elephants? Not yet? Okay, and bees, I'd like to do bees, because bees have a dance language. So what we got with humpback whales, at least the first result we got, we're still looking at the second result, but the first result we got was, in the presence of boat noise, the data rate slowed down for humpbacks that are trying to coordinate bubble netting. And what they do is they make nets of bubbles, and they chase the herring into those, and then make a kind of a intense sound and come up with their mouths open. And it's called bubble netting, and that's how they feed, one of the ways they feed. And they get together in groups and do this for about every 20 minutes. You see a dozen or more 40-ton whales come zooming up out of the ocean, and with mouths full of fish, and it's pretty exciting. So we measured, one work we did was we measured the amount of information in the presence of boat noise, and it slowed down. The data rate in bits that they were transmitting to each other, and this is just generally recording, we didn't ID the whales or anything, was slowing down in the presence of noise. But it didn't seem like it was slowing down enough. And so here's the hypothesis. If you have to slow down this much when there's this much noise, and they only slowed down 62% of that, you're going, well, wait a second, this is critical. They need to get that information. So how come they're only slowing down 62%? And the answer we suggested was that when you go down the hall and make a copy, and you get back to your desk and you go, oh shoot, it was low on toner, and I'm missing all these letters and words. Well, you can make those up because you have grammar and syntax rules. So what if the humpbacks didn't need to correct all the way? Because there's rules. They have rule structure, for lack of a better word, in their communication systems. And so we started looking for that, and we found there is indeed this higher order entropy rule structure in humpback whales, but there's a lot more work to do. And like I said, I would like to do bees. You could use polar coordinates and do their waggle dance, and maybe they can indicate by a decrease in the rule structure that hive collapse may be imminent. So you could get a measurement in between, like, here's the bees, now they're gone. Be nice to see some indication in the middle. So that idea is to try and, you know, project hive collapse. So how's this tie into SETI? Well, basically, I wish we quit saying, are we alone? Because we've got 1 million languages on Earth to practice on. And, oh yeah, one more thing. We applied information theory to a communication between a cotton plant and wasps. And we measured that. And the cotton plant puts out chemicals. And the basic idea there is that it was air traffic control, one-way communique to wasps that enable them to land on the plants that had had the predator they like, as opposed to another you know, critter that would land on the cotton plants. So the idea of doing this is that we came as close as possible to an interplanetary communique by having the plant and animal kingdoms talk to each other. So information theory, the idea of this paper was basically to demonstrate information theory applies to everything and would apply to SETI as well. So if and when we get a signal, We can apply Zipf's law. If it has this -1 slope, it's worth looking into. If it has these connections and is a complicated communication system, we've got a candidate. I think this is now Lori Marino is going to tell you, she blew us away with her talk today at the workshop, that intelligence is, you know, important and everywhere.
Thank you. Thank you, Lawrence. Thank you, Denise. And yes, it was an incredible 2 days. And I'll be somewhat brief, but I wanted to pull out of the past 2 days some of the major questions and some of the major themes and ideas that have come out of our discussion. And what is amazing, well, not so amazing, I suppose, is that there is such a thread of continuity between SETI, between the study of the evolution of intelligence, and of course, non-human communication, which is a property of intelligence. One of the things that we discussed was just the challenge of defining and measuring intelligence. There's no consensus on what intelligence is, so we are searching for it, but we are really searching for proxies of intelligence, because if there are 1,000 people in this audience, and I went around and asked, there'd be 1,000 different definitions of intelligence. So what we are doing is really looking at the properties of intelligence. One of the main points that I made this afternoon was the following, that astrobiology, exobiology, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, and all of these wonderful fields have been limited, I think, by the notion that humans are the only intelligent species on this planet. We may not actually think that, but we act like that. And when we act like that, what we do is we don't look at any of the other animals, and we don't look at how human intelligence actually arose. It didn't arise de novo. It evolved on the planet in a comparative phylogenetic context. So in order to understand our intelligence, we have to really understand it within the framework of evolution. There is no other way to really look at intelligence. I mean, Darwin told us that you know, the uniqueness of human intelligence is a scientific impossibility. We're looking at what constitutes intelligent information. I mean, this has obvious applications to, you know, interstellar messaging and SETI directly, and just how do we recognize intelligent information? A couple of the other themes that were pulled out of our discussion is that when we're talking about evolution, we're talking about an extremely conservative process. It basically works by building on a successful mechanism, and it really doesn't change unless it's necessary. And what that means is that there is a thread of continuity that we can identify that runs from the simplest organisms on this planet through all of the rest of the organisms, including us. And when we look at the milestones of the evolution of intelligence on this planet, we can find, even in unicellular organisms, the beginnings or the basis or the bow plan of nervous systems and brains. So everyone on this planet that's an animal or a unicellular organism that moves around has the same task, to take in information, process it, and then do something about it that's appropriate. And so everyone on the planet does it essentially the same way, using the same principles. And if you look at the unit of information processing in all animals, the neuron is basically the same. And again, so what that means is that if you want to understand human intelligence, or if you want to understand any kind of intelligence, including the kind of intelligence that would make a radio telescope and send a message, you have to understand all of that in the context of evolution and the fact that human intelligence is but one variation on a theme. There's continuity across all organisms on this planet in both nervous systems and intelligence. We've got a treasure trove of data that we can mine to look for things like universals in the evolution of intelligence in the brain that would inform SETI, inform any kinds of searches for extraterrestrial life on another planet. We haven't really done that. Hopefully this is the start of incorporating that whole giant treasure trove of data into SETI. Another big topic that came up was assumptions. And so, you know, there was a lot of discussion about getting out of our own head, right? How do you not be anthropocentric? And if there's any field of science that requires you to get out of your own head, it's got to be SETI. I think that we've got, you know, a lot of work to do, but I think we finally got down to saying what we had to say. Very productive, and hopefully we can move forward knowing what we know. Thank you.
Let's thank all three speakers, and then we're going to take a roughly a 5-minute break while we try and get the entire panel up here, and they will be accessible for you to ask questions after that 5-minute break.
I guess I'm going to hedge on that because, you know, it really does depend upon, you know, what you see as intelligence and how you define it. I don't think we know enough to really say one way or the other whether there's any intelligence involved in some of these systems. I can tell you that, you know, just descriptively, intelligence is about taking in information, processing it, and then acting appropriately. And there has to be a mechanism for doing that. And the mechanism on this planet is ionic movement across a membrane, which is the way we do intelligence. And it's the way your and my brain is working. We've built upon that basic mechanism, created neurons, and then networks and brains and so forth. So I would say that you can be open-minded, but I think that you'd at least have to have some kind of mechanism like that to define something as intelligent. That's what I say.
I just want to add that Lori's talk today, basically that that mechanism of intelligence goes back a bit more than 1 billion years. So that ignoring intelligence evolving through the years is to ignore a major mechanism that's been involved from the beginning. It isn't something that suddenly happened in hominids like 5 million years ago or whatever.
Right.
So, couple of questions. Are you interacting with the group that started up at TED, the Interspecies Internet? And is there any common ground there? I think you were at that TED meeting, Denise, where that got started.
Yeah, you're speaking of Diana Reese's and Peter Gabriel's. Yeah, no, I mean, we really aren't going that direction as far as captive live interactions. I don't know. We didn't really talk about it much. Okay. Yeah, I don't know if it's even progressed any. I mean, you might know more than I do.
No, I was hoping
honestly.
You could tell me.
Yeah, no. The idea was, I guess they were going to create a internet for other species to communicate with people over the internet. I'm not. Yeah, I'm not sure that's the direction we're looking for detailed intelligence, but I really haven't heard much, honestly, Jill. I don't know.
So yeah, the other question is, Lori, I think maybe I'm just overinterpreting, but I think an early paper that you did with Diana, there was some indication that the dolphin whistles, at least, had a syntax, and it might actually be subject, object, verb, kind of. Has that gone away? Am I misremembering? Is it wrong?
Well, there were a number of papers that were done. I don't remember that specific aspect. I think Brenda might be the best person to answer that.
So yes, Diana Reese and I published a paper back in 1993 looking at the use of an underwater keyboard and how the animals spontaneously imitated computer-generated whistles that were like their own whistles, but different enough so that we could recognize them. And what we found in that, some preliminary evidence that not only did the dolphins spontaneously imitate those signals without any training, so they would literally push a keyboard, hear a computer-generated whistle, and receive an object or activity, and they just spontaneously started to produce these sounds. But what we found is that they also started producing them in appropriate contexts. So, for example, they produced the ball whistle when they were playing with balls, ring whistle when they were playing with rings, but they also started producing a combination sound, which was a ring connected to a ball whistle, when they were playing with both rings and balls. So it gave us an indication that they may be using components of whistles to be combined, which actually at this workshop we talked a lot about in terms of developing new techniques that Michael Cohen can talk about, looking for segmentations in signals such that you could begin to look at the fundamental units that get recombined to make up the kinds of vocalizations that we see in the animal world. So I'd like to turn to him now to talk a little bit about that, because I think, that was a paper from 1993. We're now in 2014, and there are new techniques that we can use to really begin to understand, not from a human perspective of saying, oh, that's a ball whistle and that's a ring whistle, but rather from a data-driven perspective that removes the assumptions that we make in our human perception system, which is evolved to do certain kinds of things, and really look for the data to tell us what the animals consider to be their own units. So I think, that was early work, but we now have new techniques that are going to give us, I think, a huge advantage in beginning to decipher animal communication systems.
So I wasn't going to volunteer this, but I did mention this while we were talking. So I do have a keyboard that plays sounds. It doesn't play whistles or complete sounds. I deal with a couple of species. The one I deal with the most, people, yeah. But gibbons are a kind of ape. They're an interesting kind of ape. They're smart, they're social, they're gentle. They're sweet creatures. And they're mostly in Thailand, but we have some in Wisconsin too. What does my keyboard play, you might ask? Well, are there any linguists in the audience? Because if there are, I need to put up something to block objects being thrown in my direction. No, okay, good. It plays phonemes. So my view is that the study of vocalization in animals for a very long time has been observational and descriptive. It's not been formal or mathematical in the sense of the last half of the 20th century, the Chomskyan revolution in linguistics, which has essentially turned into a field of applied math. So the primitive things you can say, the simplest sounds you can say, like phonemes. And somebody should just tell me to shut up because I can talk forever. Yeah, I knew you were going to do that. All right. So the simplest sounds you can pronounce, they're called phonemes. You put them together. Morphemes are words. You put them together, phrases, sentences. And then you get to issues like syntax, which doesn't matter for our purposes at the moment. My idea, which I think there's a good deal of evidence for, is every species on the planet that we know of uses phonemes. That animals are not synthesizers, Moog synthesizers generating random sounds. Gibbons speak with 28 distinct sounds. Humans, well, if you're the Queen of England, you're privileged to probably have 44 phonemes. If you're a regular English speaker, you're probably about 35. But you can push it a little. But if you're from New York, like Lori and me, if you're from Brooklyn, you might got 15 if you're lucky. Yeah. So my keyboard plays Gibbon phonemes, and I can play it, and I can talk to them. So it's an example of two-way species communication. They can't speak. It's not like talking to a dog. But the Gibbons will talk back to me in Gibbon, and I will play on my keyboard in Gibbon. One of the grand discoveries here, which I expect to win a Nobel Prize for, is that Gibbon warning calls begin with the theme to Star Wars. Didn't notice this until I was giving a talk and played it, and I got so wrapped up in it, the audience was wondering what the hell. I was just playing the theme of Star Wars over and over again. It was amazing. I'd never noticed it. So anyway, the long and short of it is the notion that linguistics is a human-specific area of study. There's no evidence for this, that we have a privileged linguistic organ defies any notion of evolution through gradual modification. We could not have arisen out of nothing. We share basic linguistic things with other animals, phonemes, we have morphemes, we have a lexicon for Gibbon. We know how they say certain words, we know how to construct sentences and talk to them. They are not the most, so Lawrence's comment about translating literature into dolphinese, I don't think we're going to be translating too much into Gibbon, but we certainly can talk to them about snakes and eagles. And in fact, in Wisconsin, the Gibbons have a specific call for the Goodyear blimp when they're football games. So you have what to talk with them about. So anyway, I'll stop with that. But the notion that all the animals we know of have primitive units of speech, rats have 28, which is astonishing. And they have their own communication system, which rather than viewing it as a subset of human communication, I think it'd be much better to view communication on Earth as part of a single framework. We're one branch of it, other animals are other branches. We share much in common. We don't share everything, not everything's equivalent. And I'll stop before someone kicks me or something.
Yeah, my question is about phonemes. I understand that infants are capable of recognizing and using, like, what, 200 phonemes or something like that? And the brain kind of whittles them away until they reach the phonemes in their native tongue, which is more like 40.
Well,
and so
phonemes in human languages range from 10 to 140, depending on your native language. What I thought you were going to say, I can actually...
No, I was going to present a question related to this. And the question is, do we have a measure of how many phonemes other animal infants are capable of? And that might be a measure of the diversity of their processing for language, the potential, which might be a measure of intelligence.
We'd have to be very careful with this question. So infants, what you're talking about babbling is proto-linguistic. They're not saying phonemes. They're saying fuzzy, mushy things that, if you look at it, a spectrogram, have a certain structure. It's an anecdotal comment people often make. A 3-month-old babbling, you can tell what their native language will be, which is often the case. You can tell a 3-month-old baby who's going to be speaking English from a 3-month-old baby who's going to be speaking Chinese, but they are not using English or Chinese phonemes. But they are picking particular features that are important. And we know with zebra finches, for example, the way they crystallize to the sounds, so they sing a single song, they're not using what we would call phonemes. They're using these, and they actually kind of look like cotton balls. I mean, they're kind of fuzzy and soft, and they crystallize. That's really what it's called. They take their shape. But I think it's a difficult thing to say that this is sort of the definition people give for synesthesia. You learn to distinguish all your senses. You might say you're born knowing gazillion phonemes. Probably they're doing these simple imitative sounds, and what we would call phonemes, you have a small set, and that's it.
Do you want to talk about information theory?
No, I want Con to fill people in a little bit about his research, since it's pretty remarkable also.
Okay, well, I've been studying prairie dog language. Prairie dogs have alarm calls that they give to other prairie dogs when they see a predator. And this system has essentially provided a Rosetta Stone for me to decipher the language of prairie dogs, because when the prairie dogs give an alarm call, we can record the alarm call. We can also videotape the predator that is approaching. We can videotape the escape responses of the prairie dogs. We can analyze sonographically and statistically the alarm calls that the prairie dogs give, and then we can play back the alarm calls when no predator is present and see if the escape responses match those of the escape responses when the predator is actually there. So just to summarize this work, we have found that prairie dogs have words for different predators. So they have one word for a coyote, they have another word for a domestic dog, they have another word for a hawk, and they have another word for human. And amazingly enough, within that, they can describe the color and physical features of the individual predators. So for a human, they can describe the color of clothes that you're wearing, they can describe your general size and shape, they can describe your speed of travel. For a dog, they can describe the general size and shape of the dog, the coat color of the dog. So it's a very complex system that they have, and these are analogous to nouns like the species of the predator, coyote, dog. These are analogous also to adjectives, so that they can talk about the color and size and shape, and possibly stretching things. There might even be verbs in there talking about the speed of travel, whether the predator is running or walking or whatever. So it's a very sophisticated animal language system that we are now trying to explore. And one of the issues that we talked about in this workshop is, can we refine this to find some commonality between prairie dogs and gibbons and dolphins, and see if there is some kind of commonality in the languages of all of these. Because it's fairly clear, as has been mentioned here multiple times, that there is no gap in language between us and the rest of the animals. And so what we're looking at is, what is this commonality that we all share?
If I could just follow up, you know, as I listen to Michael and Con from the perspective of someone doing SETI, it reminds me of how different the context is. So both of them talked about being able to be face-to-face with the species that you're trying to study. And we're talking about being separated by hundreds or thousands of light years. So one of the points that Lori made is the importance of really trying to get clear about some of our assumptions. And so to me, that's one of the things that has stood out about our meeting. You know, I think we can take a sense of encouragement from this sense of the continuity of intelligence that Lori was talking about. But perhaps even more informative is to reflect on the diversity of ways that intelligence interacts with its environment. So that often we hear that we can expect extraterrestrials to be intelligent, or to have vision, because after all, we've seen vision evolve independently 40 times here on Earth. So let's send them pictures. Well, maybe that works if you have an environment very similar to the Earth, but if you live in a very different environment, you may not be able to rely on vision. And as we discussed in our workshop, even if you use vision, other beings here on Earth who have vision may represent objects very differently, even across cultures here on Earth. So I think one of the reminders that those of us involved in SETI get from a study of animal communication and intelligence is how important it is to sort of check our assumptions, and then when we think about how to communicate with another civilization, try to think about alternative ways. So it's fine to try to send them pictures, but maybe send them pictures in different formats, or send them messages that rely more on formal mathematics, so that linguists on their world trying to understand their communication system might have that as a common basis.
When you were talking about all those curves and everything, it reminded me that because it's the same for all of those animals, that they are not showing me any intelligence in terms of some communication with someone or so, that you are actually telling me about their internal mechanism that creates signals that is the same for, or creates sounds that is the same for South African whale and Alaskan whale. They have the same structure and everything. So it seems to me that we cannot have a measure of intelligence on one person or one animal, that the measure of intelligence comes from two animals that are talking together. And that can be complicated with the language, for example. If I say in Slovak language one sentence, and the same sentence in Czech language, and I have one listener here, one of them will react to it differently than this one, because in their language, interpretation of what I am saying means this one, and interpretation of this one means something else. So that the intelligence comes from the communication between at least two people. Okay.
Yeah, there's, you can look at a communication system. First of all, we've only studied southeast Alaskan humpback whales, and not every animal gives a Ziff slope of -1. So ground squirrels don't, for example. So not all animals we've looked at has a -1 slope. And we don't even know if all humpback whales do. But if you had a conversation with a person in Czechoslovakian and recorded the frequency of occurrence of the different sound types, and then you had one again in, say, Russian or in Chinese, they would give a -1 Ziff slope if you looked at the conversation, just the sounds, different sound types of the conversation.
Interpretation is not related to what I am saying.
No, I know what you're saying. See, well, what that is, we do two approaches. You do the internal analysis of the relationship between signals to each other and their conditional probabilities. And this is an unusual application of information theory, because what usually you use information theory is a transmission from individual A to individual B. And then what you compare is the initial conversation plus any ambiguity that may be involved in it, and then the transmission rate, which may or may not go through noise. You have to add Gaussian noise or whatever kind of noise it is. Then the reception, you compare that signal with what was transmitted, and if it has a conditional probability associated with it due to the noise, that's called the equivocation. So you basically have received an not unequivocal message because of the transmission noise. But usual information theory is between two individuals. That's exactly how we can use it, and that's how I used it for the transmission from the cotton plant to the wasp.
Well, I wanted to say that what this gentleman is what I heard from you is that the intelligence part comes in attempting to communicate with another species, say, or another person. And it reminds me, somebody told me once that intelligence is actually flexibility. If you're able to adapt to situations, that means you're more intelligent. That's kind of a definition of intelligence. And so if you're like working out a joint set of communication symbols, right? And one of the speakers may be inflexible and the other one is very flexible, in which case the flexible person would adapt to the inflexible one, or there's all kinds of other things, and you could see who's doing more adaptation. You could measure that maybe. Is that sort of what you're getting at?
When the computer were starting, in each science had its own words for stimulus and response. And it wasn't possible to say, I am stimulating typewriter, or I am, and it took about 20 years before all of these were joined together and the same meaning was given to each of these two words. So we have these cases, okay, also in the history, that it's not in the words that we are saying, not exactly in the sounds, but how these sounds are differentiated in this situation, in this situation, in this. And I can have the same impulse here, but in this situation it means this. And the same thing in this situation means something else. Okay? So the intelligence depends on how we communicate, not in the single person isolated from the rest of the
Yeah.
Can I give a 2-3 sentence response? Because he's raising a really good point. Oh, sorry. It's a very good point. I think you have to be familiar with the languages you're talking about to actually appreciate what you're saying. You're not making a mistake, but the issue is a statistical one. So you can say a sentence and it can mean different things, the same words, the same sound, the same recording to people who speak different languages. And so you're asking the question, how does this fit in this framework? The answer is Zipf's law doesn't apply to sentences. It applies to everything you'll say over the course of your life. It's a huge database. In that case, you'll have this beautiful power law and you'll have a straight line, and if you take the logarithm. But what you're asking is a deeper question of what happens when an actual vocalization is ambiguous and can be interpreted in 2 different languages simultaneously with different meanings because they haven't standardized yet. It's a beautiful question, but it's not the statistical question, which is what Lawrence was raising.
All right, let me, we're getting to, you can come up and talk to them. I'm sure they'd be happy to hang around and chat with you, communicate with you, as it were. So what I'd like to do is to give each of the participants in the workshop just a minute or so to say briefly what they got out of this and what their experience was.
What I got out of the workshop was some remarkable things that, like, for example, intelligence should be studied from organisms over 1 billion years ago, and the correct use of linguistic terms. Prairie dogs are really smart. SETI is such a natural, I already know, Brenda and I have worked together for a couple decades, so, but just... She's not that old. Right, we started when she was 5, yeah. And then Doug and Jerry bringing in the SETI component, and for me, I'm trained in astrophysics, but I'm really privileged, I feel, to be part of animal communications because it's so grounding, and it grounds SETI into, non-human communication systems, which is a natural context to do SETI. It's much more natural than SETI's off over here doing something unusual. It's it's unusual the scale, but the process itself fits so nicely. So what I got mostly out of the whole thing was that it really is a privilege to work with these very bright folks. I try and work with people that are always smarter than I am, and that way things work out.
Well, just very briefly, over the past 2 days, I think what's jumped out at me are the commonalities. There's a few themes here, one about shedding assumptions, and one about continuity, and another theme about context, whether it's the context of a communication or the evolutionary context of intelligence and the evolution of intelligence. So I think that, you know, we just hit the sweet spot in terms of getting all of the major themes together, and I was just delighted to be involved and so happy to see all of these objective quantitative techniques being used to analyze non-human communication systems. It's just so exciting, and I hope we can do the same thing with some of what we know about the evolution of brains and intelligence.
I've been struck as well about this whole theme of trying to shed our assumptions or start to get clear about what some of those assumptions are. And in a sense, this workshop provides an excellent foundation for another workshop that we're doing 3 weeks from now at the SETI Institute, which is to focus on how we would create interstellar messages that might be understandable. And one of the things that strikes me from this workshop is just that it is such a sobering task that we have to try to say something meaningful. I mean, we had a wonderful example I was watching here of what happens when we are trying to come to a common understanding. We go back and forth, we ask questions, we get clarification, and when we attempt to make contact with another civilization, we won't have that option. So we have to try to find something that might be universal. Some of those assumptions that we've had is that we will have a shared technology. And so when we talk about the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, well, this is something that Jill Tarter has said often. What we're really talking about is the search for extraterrestrial technology. And so I think we need to try to unpack what that assumption about technology means. And you know, even as we try to understand the technologies that other intelligence here has, how widespread tool use is among a variety of species, I think it gives us some sense for understanding some continuities, but also very different approaches. So, you know, I think the upshot is that as we move ahead with SETI, as we really think about what it would take to have a meaningful contact, we may not be able to do it as readily as we imagined when we started out 50 years ago, that they'll automatically recognize a series of prime numbers. But, you know, from this workshop, the idea that maybe different species do have, there are a number of species here that can count. So maybe that there is hope, and that we can ground some of our attempts in the work that these people doing comparative biological research are doing.
I have 2 microphones.
Stereo.
Stereo. Go ahead. Some people make the assumption that we humans are the only ones with language, and we humans are the only ones who are intelligent, and we search among the stars for similar intelligences who would have a language that we understand. And one of the things that this workshop demonstrates to, I think, all of us who participated in it, is that we have multiple intelligences here with multiple languages here. And that while it's certainly a very worthy goal to search for intelligences in the stars, we also need to look at the intelligences and the languages that we have here as a model of what we would do when we encountered intelligences outside, out there.
Okay, of course I've been sitting here trying to think of something clever to say, and I haven't come up with a thing yet. All I can say is if you can spend a couple of days with really nice, incredibly smart people who are like-minded and have a similar worldview, I don't know what's better. This was awesome. Thank you, Denise.
That's it? Really?
For me?
That's all you're going to say? Finally! No, just kidding. Just kidding. Just kidding.
You know, if they paid us by the word for how much we spoke at this conference, I would be rich.
No. Michael, you brought a lot to the conference, of course. So well, for me, what is striking about this meeting was how similar of a trajectory we're all on as far as how to kind of approach this, the start of all this in decoding animal communication, because the starting point for all of it is categorizing these pesky little sounds and signals so that we can build the story and figure out meaning and function and look at complexity. And for me, it's about hope. Having looked at dolphin sounds for 30 years and been very frustrated not having tools, and now we have objective data-driven tools that we can potentially really look at what is in there and what in the heck are they doing with it. To me, it gives me hope. And there are a lot of species, and someone like Con has worked for decades too, the manual way, deciphering the little prairie dogs. You know, I'm looking forward to not doing that for 30 years and using some of Michael's tools and Brenda's, and so that's been great. So that gives me hope to really have some answers soon.
Thanks. The thing that struck me most about this workshop, again, was the research that has been done on animal communication and how complex that communication is, and therefore it sort of irresistibly led to the conclusion that how intelligent these animals are, you know, based in you know, any measure of intelligence that is used for human beings. It turns out that it's all over the place. You know, all animals have those same kinds of intelligence to different degrees, but still, you know, going back to even single cell critters, you know, that they still have the basics, the building blocks of very complex communication built into them, you know, already at that single cell level. So it was really terrific. And like you said, like-minded. You know, I was thinking we don't spend a lot of time arguing about, you know, things that really would not pertain to the workshop. That's we have dinner. Well, the workshops, but yeah. So I think that Denise did a great job of picking people and organizing. Thank you, and Lori too, Lori Walton.
And I'll just finish up by saying, sort of bring back the idea of continuity, because I think we've known for some time that at least the people here who have studied non-humans, either their intelligence, their cognition, or their communication, that there's very good reason to believe that continuity would exist. But what's happening now, because of the kinds of computational power that we have and the tools that we have, is that we're actually going to be able to show that in a way that is not biased by our human perceptual systems, and will really allow us to begin to develop models that will give us the fundamental processes that allow us to look at the evolution of intelligence, the evolution of complex communication, that we can use then to look for SETI signals. So I think it all comes, I mean, it literally goes from, it's just one, the continuity is here because we are going to be able to do that with the tools that are being developed now. And we're in a very exciting time where we can look at both, you know, big data approaches as well as other approaches to looking at intelligent systems. So very exciting indeed. Thank you again, Denise, for putting this all together, and Lori and everybody here.
I want to thank everybody for coming tonight, and let's please give the speakers, the entire panel, a round of appreciation.